Welcome everybody to the second in our series of faith and empowerment talks by, you know the phrase by now, seasoned Cambridge practitioners, okay? We've had one, Ruby Quanson-Davis, who spoke last time about peace building, and today I'm delighted to welcome Philip Powell, who is a seasoned Cambridge practitioner on the theme of empowerment and development, faith empowerment and development. So Philip has worked with Tear Fund for many years. He's a theologian at the Tear Fund Development Agency. He can tell you more about that. He's got an MA in Politics and International Relations, and he's got advocacy experience at the UN, the EU, and the UK Parliament, and within the international NGO sector more broadly. Born and raised in India, he moved to the UK in 1998. He's visited over 30 countries and every continent, speaking on issues of global justice, development, human rights, theology, social ethics, and related topics. And he's also authored research and policy papers on issues of global justice. He's passionate about human rights and the struggle to achieve a more just and peaceful international order that will benefit the poor. That's the official stuff. I also have to say that I've known Philip personally for nearly 20 years. It is about that long, isn't it? My life has been enriched by my friendship with Philip in lots of ways. Philip's a wonderful guy. He's been a wonderful friend and colleague. We've worked together in a number of different settings, including most recently co-teaching a course on biblical justice at Wesley House. I can't say he's followed in my footsteps, but he did marry a Dutch woman and has had 2 children. So, I mean, that's, you know, we're in sync on that one very much. So he's a person of good taste as well as expertise and faith. It's a real pleasure to welcome Philip. He's going to speak to us for about half an hour, and then we'll have a conversation in the light of that. Philip, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for those kind words. And indeed, when I first met Jonathan, when he had moved to Cambridge and gave your inaugural Kleist lecture, I came along with somebody who knew Jonathan, and I was very glad that I came along because I heard Jonathan speak, and I said, oh, I'd love to get to know Jonathan better. And I'm very glad that we've had that chance to get to know each other better, and I'm hoping for some future adventures as well, including some doctoral studies, if it does happen at some point. It's good to be back at St. Paul's. I was here at St. Paul's, actually, for over 2 years, between 2015 and 2017. I was worshiping here, and I have very joyful and memories of being part of this community here at St. Paul's. So thank you, Imogen, Jonathan, Andy, for having me back. I'm going to speak to you this evening about empowerment through development. At least that's the topic I've been given. I put development in inverted commas, and I subtitled it, Continuing the Conversation. And since I feel like we're among friends, this is a chance for us to engage in a kind of discussion. And I hope what I've said provokes us to think more critically and think more carefully about the subject of empowerment and empowerment through development. But before I begin, I'd like to say a little bit about myself, partly because I think I want to be a bit ethnobiographical. I want to share with you who I am, so you know some of the things I'm going to say comes from somewhere, from somebody who has had a particular kind of life. Let me also say that I am speaking this evening in a personal capacity, even though I work for Tear Fund and I've got Tear Fund branding in my slide deck. I'm speaking more in my own capacity, so I'm going to try to use this evening's talk and discussion as a way for me to sort of think through some issues. I'm writing a chapter for a book about Tear Fund's approach to poverty, and some of this is in that book, and I'm trying to see what comes from what I'm sharing. So please do ask questions, and I'd be very keen to hear your honest feedback. So a little about myself. I was born and raised in India. My parents still live in Chennai. In fact, I'm going there on Saturday this week to spend a week with my parents. I grew up in a very conservative, very even fundamentalist kind of Christian home. So if somebody had said to me anything about politics or about justice, I would have not been interested in it growing up, because I was primarily interested in saving souls, making sure if the rapture happened, I was going to go to heaven. But as I look back at my life, and the first half of my life I spent in India, poverty was not something you saw on a screen that was happening out there. There's this famine in Ethiopia. Poverty was what was there in our doorstep. People that we knew directly, people that we knew and we were trying to serve, went to an English-speaking church, a Methodist church, which is a lot more conservative in India. We were very involved in social action, mercy ministry. So that's the kind of upbringing I had. And then I came to the UK in 1998, as Jonathan mentioned, and worked for a mission agency that was trying to do a lot of discipleship. I did a lot of teaching and training and traveling the world. But I always sort of struggled with some aspects of what I did in that work I did for over a decade. And one of the things that I struggled with is why Christians that took the Bible very seriously, that talked a lot about mission, struggled to get their heads around the issue of justice. Why didn't justice matter? And it was always there right from a very young age in my life. As Jonathan mentioned, my background is actually not in theology or in development studies, it's actually in politics and international relations. And so I've carried this sense of wanting to always bring that question of justice into the conversations we're having in the church, when we talk about mission, when we talk about the gospel. And then at a certain point, I decided to, and it was in that time that I actually was able to do some advocacy work when I was in this organization, including being at the UN and being the main sort of representative of this organization at the UN, both in Geneva and New York. So I got exposure into sort of the big questions of the day about human rights, about development, about women's empowerment. Always trying to sort of come up with the sort of critical questions, what is going on here? After I left YWAM in 2009, I spent some years working with a group called Speak, with Jonathan's son-in-law, who I was working with for a while. They were very committed to campaigning, very committed to sort of protesting against things that were wrong in the world. And I began to sort of ask the question, it's one thing to know what you're against, but how do you implement and institutionalize what you're for? That's more complicated. And after I left this group called Speak Network, and for a while I also worked with something called Micah Challenge, which was an initiative to get the churches in the UK to support the Millennium Development Goals. I started working for, and the reason I moved to Cambridge is because, hey Chris, and the reason I moved to Cambridge was I got a job with a think tank here in Cambridge called Jubilee Center, and some of you might know Jubilee Center. And Jubilee Center was seeking to, at that point, wanting to develop some training for young leaders. They had developed a lot of research into how the Bible can shape public life. And I found that the Jubilee Center had quite a robust, a biblically based, robust critique of capitalism. And I was very attracted to that. So I joined the Jubilee Center and I worked with them for 8 years, leading a lot of training programs. In fact, one summer I brought some of the participants of a summer program here to St. Paul's, actually in 2015, which is when I first got introduced to the church. I think, Jonathan, you might have spoken at that program in 2015, and you told that, you go to St. Paul's. So we came here because the participants in the program were staying at the YMCA. And then after I left the Jubilee Center in 2021, I've been at Jubilee Center, I've been at Tear Fund. And so some of my things that I'm going to share this evening comes from my work in Tear Fund. So let me say a little bit about Tear Fund, and I'm going to go through this quickly. For about the next 15 minutes, I'm going to go through these slides a bit quickly, and then we have got half an hour to have a conversation together. Tear Fund is an international evangelical Christian relief and development agency working in around 50 countries with a primary focus on supporting and serving communities living in poverty. And I say evangelical because the very word TEAR stands for the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund. Founded in 1968, over 50 years ago, after Christians in the UK started sending money spontaneously to the Evangelical Alliance to help people affected by the famine that was happening in Africa. And if John Stott is a name that you might know. He was the first president of Tearfund. He was somebody that really played a big part in sort of mainstreaming Tearfund as an evangelical development agency. And today, Tearfund's sort of USP is, we are Christ-centered and committed to working through the local church. And there's going to be some videos I'll show that tells a little bit more about how Tearfund is working through the local church. So this is Tearfund's vision, to see people freed from poverty, living transformed lives, fulfilling their God-given potential. The mission of Tearfund is to follow Jesus where the need is greatest, responding to crises, and partnering with local churches and organizations to help people lift themselves out of poverty. So here, there's some photos you might be able to see from a long time ago. There's Cliff Richards there, who was a big sort of ambassador for Tearfund, and the logo has changed over the years. Initially, it was the Tearfund, the Evangelical Alliance Relief. So it was initially Year Fund, Evangelical Alliance Refugee Fund. And some PR person said, Year Fund doesn't sound as good as Tearfund. So it was changed to Tearfund. And so now we just go by Tearfund. Most people don't know what the acronym stands for. I want to do two things. One is to talk about sort of Tearfund's theological framework for the kind of empowerment work that we are doing. And it's important to understand this because Tearfund is very invested in what we do being an outworking of mission. As I said, we are Christ-centered. And the phrase that is used to describe our theological framework is integral mission. And I want to talk a little bit about integral mission, where it's come from, and just explain how that informs our praxis. To start off with, integral mission is actually something that is not new to the church worldwide, but it's something that was quite radical for evangelical Christians. If I said in this context, we should do both social stuff and spiritual stuff, it's just what you expect. But given the time in which this idea was birthed, especially among Christians that were identified with people like Billy Graham, there was a global event that was happening in Lausanne under the leadership of Billy Graham called the Lausanne Congress for World Evangelization. And there was a man named René Padilla. He's the man on your left there with that little goatee beard. He looks a little bit like Francis Schaeffer, but that's a different person. He was from Ecuador, and along with two other South Americans, one guy by the name of Samuel Escobar, who was from Peru, and another more radical missiologist by the name of Orlando Costas from Puerto Rico. The three of them were seen as these sort of Latin troublemakers. And they came to this Congress in Lausanne, and René Padilla gave a talk about how mission can't simply be about saving souls. And he talked about mission integral, missio integral in Spanish. And that started a kind of movement that has been around for 50 years that Tearfund has become very identified with, is that mission cannot simply be about spiritual stuff. It has to also deal with the social, political issues of the day. Especially in Latin America, with all the kind of revolutions that were going on with dictators and student protest. René Padilla challenged, especially North American Christians, to not talk about mission in this very truncated way of just evangelism. But maybe, given that I'm giving this talk here in the city of Cambridge, it'll be good to sort of maybe go back a little bit in history and realize that there was this very famous missions conference that took place in Edinburgh called the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference. And even at that conference, you began to see the kind of split that was happening between sort of the people that were coming from the world of Christendom that wanted to sort of finish the Great Commission, evangelizing the world in our generation, with a guy named John Mote. And there were Christians that had come to this conference from places like India, where the nationalist movement was sort of beginning to emerge. India wants independence. And even there in that conference in 2010, a split was emerging between sort of conservative Christians that wanted to talk about evangelism and spiritual stuff, and Christians that wanted to talk about more political, social stuff. And here in Cambridge, as you know, there was a split that happened from the older student Christian movement and a new movement that emerged that's called KICU, that is still around today, the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union. And people like John Stott were identified with KICU. And this split, I think, ran through the whole of the 20th century, dividing Christians between sort of more progressive Christians that were identified with the World Council of Churches and the Lausanne movement for world evangelization that said, actually, the most important thing is to talk about evangelism. And it is in this gathering in Lausanne in 1974, René Padilla gave this talk about integral mission. And I think this background is important because to really understand what Tear Fund has tried to do in its sort of effort to bring empowerment through development, we need a bit of this history, and I'm happy to talk about this further. If we go to the next slide on the 4 broken relationship. So this is how Tear Fund has understood why there is poverty in the world. And we believe there is poverty in the world because of these 4 broken relationships, because of the fall in Genesis 3. A relationship with God is broken, relationship with yourself is broken, relationship with others is broken, and your relationship with creation is broken. And the consequence of these broken relationships is that there is poverty. I was recently in a conversation with a colleague, with a friend from World Vision, who was sort of questioning even the very use of that word broken. Broken from whose perspective? But leaving that aside, and so what is the response if poverty is understood as the consequence of broken relationships? Tear Fund believes that the restoration of those relationships is our response to poverty, and we call this integral mission. Christian, I think he's a theologian, missiologist, someone like Chris Wright has talked about the 5 marks of mission. This is actually from the Anglican Church, which some of you might know, but in some ways he's also talked about this being the 5 marks of integral mission. There we go. Yes. And I spoke last week at Ridley about the 4th mark of mission, and I spoke the week before to the Vineyard Leadership Training Program on the 5th mark. So these 5 marks about evangelism, discipleship, mercy ministries, doing justice, creation care. Of course, Tear Fund doesn't do all of these, but we believe that we are uniquely contributing to God's work of mission 3, 4, and 5. It's not a ticking box exercise that you start with 1 and then you get to 5. I think they are actually a very robust, integrated way of thinking about God's mission through the church. Can I just say that the organization that I used to work for, the mission organization from 98 to 2009, the 3 things they said their mission was about was evangelism, training, and mercy ministries. And given they're North American and quite conservative, they identified with the first 3, but had very little to say about 4 and 5. But there's also groups that would sort of be very happy to identify with 4 and 5 and feel a bit, sort of a bit of a question mark about 1, maybe 2 as well. But let me just read this quote about how Tear Fund understands mission. Because what we do in terms of empowerment through development comes out of our understanding of what the mission is. So this is what it says. Integral mission is the church speaking of and living out its faith in Jesus Christ in an undivided way in every aspect of life. It is the work of the church in contributing to the positive physical, spiritual, economic, psychological, and social transformation of people. It is the pursuit of God's shalom, an abundant life for all of creation. I'm going to skip over the quote from René Padilla, which is a long quote about how everyone is called to mission, not just a small group of people who are meant to do mission work. But I'm going to jump over that quote. But let me also read maybe this other quote from the Micah Declaration, which is a movement of mainly organizations like Tear Fund that have signed up to something they have said is the Micah's Declaration of Mission. And I'll read this one. I'm just aware that I want to show some videos, and I don't want to not show the videos because of time. Integral mission or holistic transformation is the proclamation and demonstration of the gospel. It is not simply that evangelism and social involvement are to be done alongside each other. Rather, in integral mission, our proclamation has social consequences as we call people to love and repentance in all areas of life. And our social involvement has evangelistic consequences as we bear witness to the transforming grace of Jesus Christ. If we ignore the world, we betray the word of God, which sends us out to serve the world. If we ignore the word of God, we have nothing to bring to the world. So this is Tear Fund's theological framework for why we do what we do, integral mission. Now I want to talk about one particular aspect of Tear Fund's work, which has come to be known as church and community transformation. And Tear Fund has always, right from the very beginning, sought to work through the local church. Like if you think about compassion, you think about child sponsorship. So for Tear Fund, the USP has always been working through the local church as the church seeks to be an agent of transformation in the community. So let me show this video, which actually gives us a chance to understand what church and community transformation is.
Over the last 25 years, Tear Fund has partnered with 25,000 churches, empowering them through a process we call Church and Community Transformation, or CCT for short.
It's like an awakening.
It's changing the mindset of the communities.
L'enseignement du PMEC a impacté ma vie pour que je puisse vraiment aller vers les autres.
So what is CCT? I'll let our friends in Burundi explain.
CCT ni umugambi ukorana n'amashengero y'Ukristo. Uwo mugambi ugakorana kandi n'abanyagihugu. Ni inyigisho zishingiye ku majambo y'Imana, maze bamaze kuyigira hamwe akabahindura mu buryo bw'impwemu no mu buryo bw'umubiri.
After going through those CCT teachings, they discovered that they are able to do the development without external support.
So CCT is enabling churches all over the world to bring holistic transformation and renew hope. But how does it actually work?
We open the eyes of the pastors and the church leadership to see how the church should bring holistic transformation in the community. We always tell them that they should use local resources. So the church leaders start to be the catalyst of the transformation, and the church members identify the problems that are in a community.
At Tear Fund, we believe that the church is at the center of God's plan for healing and restoration of his world. But why the church?
We believe that the church is like a dormant giant. Once awakened, it can just bring transformation in any community.
Diante da maior cheia da série histórica, a igreja também foi demandada dar a sua maior resposta. E aí nós tivemos que retirar 420 pessoas de dentro das suas casas, abrigar 80 pessoas, alimentar estas pessoas.
In addition to rapid response in disaster, communities are being transformed in so many ways due to the Bible-based training of CCT.
When we meet here once a week to learn the Word of God, support each other and listen to testimonies, we go home as renewed and hopeful people.
Nakukwata kwe kumazu nakulufuele holilingana bya jingoma na bizinguna labe bya kunyima byose na binakusoloka bya uchi binakuma bahana muzala na watana labe moje uze wonjini
nkuko babivuze abashidikoni kuko twarahangayika iyo umuntu agwaye kumutarika mu ijoro umutwara hariya byaragorana ariko izo nyigisho zimaze kuza harabo umugambi wo kuja hamwe ishengero barakora umugambi wo kubaka ibitaro.
Les autres églises, les autres dénominations qui ont appris notre histoire sont en train de courir vers nous pour que nous allions vers eux pour les aider.
We have worked with over 25,000 local churches in the last 25 years, but our vision is for 250,000 by 2030. £1 invested in CCT equals £28 of social value released. So please, help us support more communities as they help themselves.
Thank you, Andy. I was going to spend a bit more time talking about a recent impact study that Tear Fund commissioned through an independent research agency. They were not Christian, they were a secular agency that basically looks into whether development agencies like Tear Fund are actually having the impact they claim they're having, because a lot of the stories are anecdotal. And there was a video I wanted to show, but I think I'm happy if you want to see it or find out more about it. But one of the things that this research found out, if you go to slide 17 actually, we'll skip over the video, is that the data point showed that in 23 different aspects of well-being, in every one of them, communities that were impacted because of the church going through this training, in every one of them, it showed that there was a positive impact that the CCT training had, the church and community training. It's part of a sort of a Bible study, a series of envisioning that happens. And then the community comes together to find out how they can solve their own problems. And I just came back from Kenya in February, visiting a community that had been doing CCT for over 20 years. And my work is quite in the UK because my role in my theology work is very focused on how Tear Fund can engage the UK church. How can Tear Fund basically challenge the UK church to give to Tear Fund, of course, but also to pray, but also to take action. So I've not traveled a great deal in my work with Tear Fund, but at this church we visited in Kenya, it was about 5 hours drive from Nairobi towards Mount Kenya. And the person in Kenya who was hosting us kept describing that this place was back of the beyond. I honestly can tell you, I couldn't find this place on Google Maps because I wanted to post a photograph of my visit to the church on Instagram, and Instagram couldn't find this place. So it's out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, there were no roads actually, and there were about 30 women that sort of welcomed us by singing as we drove in this van into this church. And then we spent the whole day there, including having lunch that they had prepared for us. And this church had incredible stories. And one of the things that really moved me was one woman telling the story of how she saw herself as being nothing. She said she couldn't do anything, She was a single mother. And how she's got quite involved in civic, it's almost like local politics, but trying to sort of speak up for the women in this community and what's going on with them. Now, from our perspective, we can still see that there's a lot that community is dealing with corruption, with challenging things in the environment. But the way they see it is their lives have improved. And I think for me, having been at Tear Fund for 4 years, I'm very compelled by this sort of approach in which empowerment is not done for them, but through these sort of Bible studies that were created, the church begins to become engaged in the community. And there are stories from around the world. And this study that was done by this independent research institute shows that the impact is very significant. But we can talk more about it. As I sort of come to land with my talk, I just thought it'll be good to why don't we watch the video that's on slide deck 20, actually. Let's watch this video of this one other story, and then I'll finish with some more critical things for us to have a conversation about. Let's watch this video of what this pastor is saying, and then I'll say something before we finish.
CCT has really changed my life. One of the things that CCT has been able to do to my life is to transform my mindset. Because before this CCT, my life was so hard. I was a poor. I was a beggar. Together with my wife and my kid, we lived a life that was so painful. But after we came across the CCT approach, it helps us to realize that we can take charge of our future. We can change our life. We can rewrite our story. From there, after going through some Bible studies, the foundational Bible studies, God's purpose for humankind, God's vision for his people, all these Bible studies, they begin to open my mind. And I began to realize that I can and I am able to transform my life. From there, because of these Bible studies, I began a small project of indigenous chickens. Within a short period of time, because of God's grace and what I have learned through CCT, my chicks begins to increase. And I began to take it as a business because my mindset has been transformed. From there, raising a lot of chickens, we begin to diversify, doing road runners, bread making, in sort of rabbit keeping. From there, our lives begin to bloom bit by bit until the time we had enough income through those income generative initiatives. Then we proposed, those days we were renting a one room. I just want you to imagine you are a pastor, you are calling yourself a man of God, and you are renting a one room house, and you are staying in that house with your child, with your wife. You know, the whole picture was not quite good, even to the community. You know, how can we stay in a single room, the whole family? It was because of poverty. But after we have realized some income, number one, we were able to purchase a piece of land. After purchasing a piece of land, we continue doing our projects. We built our 3-roomed house. After constructing our 3-roomed house, we shifted from one room into that 3-roomed house. Our lives began to take a shape. Even the people around us could even see that things are beginning to change. Our lives was developing. We could see the transformation. We also began a big project. So we began to have a lot of projects that were bringing in some income, and our lives begin to bloom. There was a great transformation. Even our way of living has totally changed. From one meal, we could have even 3 decent meals. Could have a good breakfast, lunch, and supper, because we now have enough resources to cater for that. Besides that, we're able to also to have electricity at our home place. We both have the electricity and the solar power. We also managed to buy an incubator. We are also into chicken projects. So from there, our life was so much changed, and we begin to enjoy even our position within the community. I am a product of CCT, and I'm glad and I'm quite confident that CCT is the way. It transforms. It brings a person, a total person, to a point of understanding that God has a purpose with mankind.
I want to sort of finish with this slide, the last one. These are great stories, and there are many stories like this of people whose lives have been transformed. But for this evening, as we sort of try to grapple with some difficult issues, I think there can be 4 things that I identified with empowerment through development. One is the question of the relationship between doing charity work and the struggle for justice. What is the relationship between doing charity and doing justice? In Micah 6:8, it says, love mercy, but also do justice. There's the other issue of white saviorism. The celebrities from the UK going and getting photos with children and wanting to show that somehow they're trying to do some good in the world. But there's a more fundamental critique of whether development work reinforces this kind of saviorism. There's also the question of whether the Christian faith itself has been a colonial imposition on some of these communities where there's poverty, and has been the cause of that poverty because it has been used to justify oppression, or is Christianity indigenous, the Christian faith, a very robust Christian faith? I was reading somewhere where this article was saying that every day in Africa, 20,000 people are joining the church. And the average age of Africa is around 13, 14. And the final point that I wanted to say was development itself, I think, there's a big question mark about development, whether development is actually misguided because it mistakes we need to modernize these people to become like us being Westerners. It does not critique and challenge Western hegemony and creates kind of dependency among nations that have to play by the rules that are made by somebody else who has more power. So there's all sorts of things we can we can talk about this evening, but I think I'll finish with this one quote from one of a theologian who has had a great impact on my own thinking. And this is what Gustavo Gutierrez says: "But the poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral, and it is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct of the system in which we live and by which we are responsible, and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are the oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor and despoiled of their humanity. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order." Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks so much indeed for a very instructive, inspiring, and at least at the end there, quite provocative talk. I'm sure we want to pick some of those questions up. We've got about 25 minutes for a conversation here. I'll pass the mic around as people have questions. But we've already got one. Okay, I'll hold off my question till the end. Okay. No, go ahead. Imogen, do you need this?
Probably not. Thank you so much. So interesting. I'm so glad you brought in liberation theology at the end, because I wanted to ask you about the relationship, the differences and similarities between the model that you were presenting to us from Tear Fund and liberation theology. Are there differences and similarities?
Actually, could you just repeat the question briefly so it's recorded? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Imogen. Is there similarities and differences between the approach that I presented, CCT, and liberation theology? Can I just say that liberation theology itself has gone through many versions and, sort of second generation, third generation liberation theology. Because this quote from Gutierrez is from his book that was published in the 60s. Tear Fund's approach, I think, takes on this challenge of not trying to do development in the sort of 60s kind of way, where we go and sort of do things for them. So there is, I think CCT has sought to work through the local church without putting in a lot of resources to see how this mindset shift through studying the Bible means that there's a lot of self-help kind of approach to it. So local communities, like the story of the man who spoke from Zimbabwe, the pastor from Zimbabwe, is very moving. And when you actually go to these places and see how this transformation is actually real, the big question that I think Gutierrez brings, or liberation theology brings, is, but what about the fourth mark of mission? What is it going to take to transform unjust structures? Because you can do all of this great local work, but we do need good governance. We do need people who are able to step into public leadership. So, in a sense, I think, in my mind, and this is not to sort of give a fudge sort of response, but I genuinely think the big question is, how do we see in places where there is corruption, in places where there's extreme poverty, a vision of national life that can begin to turn things around, not because these local things don't matter, they do matter. There's a sort of bottom-up development happening here. But I also think, like for example in Malawi, I was reading how the government had made some decisions on what they spent their money in terms of health. And over a 10-year period, the health outcomes dramatically shifted. And so for me, liberation theology forces on you the question about structures. Because unless we deal with structures, not just at the national level, but also the global structures. When we think about empowerment through development, and there's a lot of things written about how poverty is about powerlessness. But sometimes I've wondered whether the powerlessness is not so much there where there is poverty, but also here. Most of us are powerless to deal with the unwillingness of our governments to do the right thing in relation to the people in this country, but also the right thing in relation to people living in poverty elsewhere. Most of the time, the government is a sort of client of big capital and have to sort of provide them with what, well, we can talk about that more, but I think the powerlessness is across the board, and liberation theology forces us to grapple with structures. I think that's what I would say. So this is not to say that we can sort of, it's not an either or, but CCT can, in itself locally, that local community transformation is not good enough in my view. And I've said this in Tear Fund, and I know people in Tear Fund are grappling with how do we work to bring transformation of unjust structures so that we have more just structures. So, can I just also make maybe a quick comment about the role of prayer? I do think when we talk about unjust structures, we're not just dealing with human structures that have been, sort of the Enlightenment has made us see that there's the world and then there is God. I do think there is something in terms of what the scriptures talk about, powers and principalities, that are invested in keeping unjust structures in place. Most people living in poverty know that it's not just the corrupt politician who's holding public office. There's something going on spiritually. And it's very easy to dismiss them. Now, of course, there's ways you go about engaging with these things and ways you don't. But I do think prayer is an important part of our engagement to seeing transformation in the world. And people like John Stott would understand that. Yeah, and we don't want to
save souls and gain
Sure.
So
Yeah.
Very limited.
Yeah. Yes, I understand conversion holistically.
Okay. Chris.
Thanks. I really like the way you took the journey through to explain CCT. How much is CCT itself renewed by the local churches now as a kind of movement? Is it very grassroots up, or is it kind of...
Yeah.
Is it quite a rigid framework these days? Yeah.
And we sort of police it. Thanks, Chris, for that. From what I know, it has happened in a sort of dialectic relationship between Tear Fund initiating something, churches then working with that, because CCT is like the set of, it's a much more sort of, it's a framework, a tool, but the process itself used to be called Church and Community Mobilization Process, CCMP, and we realized that CCMP in Kenya doesn't look like CCMP in Nepal. So they started calling different names even to these things. Imoja was one word. There's a very Nepali word that's used to talk about the community mobilization process. Because it's one thing to do it in a place where the church is a very powerful actor within civil society. It's another thing for it to happen somewhere where Christians are a minority. And so there's also questions about what is CCT in places like Syria, which are predominantly Muslim countries. So there is a sort of dialectic way in which this has developed. I know at the moment there are 6 pillars that make up CCT. I wish I could put I could name the 6, but there is discussion about wanting to add a 7th to the 7, make it 7 pillars. And the 7th one is about engaging power structures. So the bit that I've been sort of banging on about in Tear Fund for about 4 years seems to be getting some traction, because it's not simply about what you do on in the local community, because you can have a great stuff going on in local community, government changes, and it can all get wiped out. It doesn't completely get wiped out. So it's not a sort of, Teddington is sort of imposing this, conscientizing people in places around the world to go with this. It's much more dynamic, and we don't own it. The church sort of runs with it. This church that I went to in Kenya have been doing it, and I think they would have done it for most of the time, even if no Tear Fund person showed up. So, but thank you for that question. Anyone else?
Philip, thank you very, very much. You mentioned about an impact study and bringing in I think you called them an independent research institute. Without going into great detail, what's Tear Fund done with the findings from that agency's research?
Thank you. And what was it Alistair?
Alistair,
thank you for that.
And by the way, if you add a 7th pillar, you can have a book called The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. It's quite a well-known book.
Is that Thomas Merton? No, it's Lawrence. Okay. There's 7 mountains, I think. Sorry, I've now lost the question, Alistair.
The research.
Yes. Tear Fund has been able to get quite a bit of media publicity around it. I know the Church Times wrote a big article about the study that was done. There are people in DFID that have picked up, well, what used to be DFID back then, and people in government have had to sort of look at it. And because it's been a very key study that's done by a very reputed agency. I'm very happy to point you to stuff that Tear Fund they've now commissioned, I think, to do this study. It was done in 4 countries in Africa, and they want to do another 8 and see whether the same results are coming out. But also, I think the question then becomes, if this is true, how do you scale it up? Which is why Tear Fund now believes if this is really making a difference, how do we go from 25,000 churches to 250,000 churches? So just those are a few things. Yeah. Do one more? Andy.
Philip, I loved your talk. I wonder how the work that you're talking about, how that relates to sort of other sort of parallel efforts on development, in particular countries or cities that you're operating. What fraction is Tear Fund versus other development organizations? I don't know, like Christian Aid or other or charities that aren't Christian, and whether Tear Fund coordinates with other charities or development projects.
Tear Fund works closely with other charities. DEC, the network of NGOs that are doing this sort of work in the sector. So we're of course working with others in the sector, especially when there's natural disasters, humanitarian crisis. Tear Fund is often working with others. I have not heard a lot in Tear Fund about sort of taking a human rights approach. I've hardly heard sort of development being thought of in terms of human rights, because in the early 2000s, development was understood as one of the human rights that people have or communities have. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that this approach that Tear Fund has taken in terms of CCT is quite unique. But increasingly, I know there are national charities, including Christians Against Poverty, that are looking to see how churches in the UK can begin to take the lessons that Tear Fund has been able to learn and some of that wisdom that's come from community mobilization and apply them here. Now, of course, Tear Fund doesn't do programming work in the UK, but I know that there are organizations in the UK that are doing it as well. I think with regards to the scale of poverty we have in the world, Tear Fund is just a small actor that's trying to contribute to seeing how that can be overturned. But surely poverty in the world is not going to be completely solved, or whatever word you want to use, through an organization like Tear Fund. It's much bigger than Tear Fund, and therefore we have to also be very realistic on what does success look like for us. Yeah.
Do you have time for a couple more?
I really liked your 4 questions. I don't know if you get them back up again.
Sure. So one slide before.
And I was just going to ask you about, because I think they're all really important questions, and I think it captures where so much of the situation is now. Post-development, with US aid cuts, with all these things, how do you kind of see where do you think we are at the moment? To throw it back to you.
And you've got 2 minutes.
A bit more.
I'm trying to kind of hold myself back from starting somewhere in
we can switch the recording off if you're going to say something, Dan.
Thanks. Yeah. This should not be online. Chris, we are in an interesting moment in history. I mean, everybody feels like they're in an interesting moment in history, but it does feel like the post-1945 international order is in crisis, but also the longer sort of story of the rise of the West and the dominance of the West. There seems to be shifts happening. Tectonic plates in world history are shifting, and when you're caught up in it, it's very difficult to be able to step back and make pronouncements, or so the analysis is not possible. But what I would say is that through things like BRICS and the sort of countries that are coming together to the fact that the G20 is still around, because it was initially put together after the financial crisis in 2008, 2008. G20 is beginning to have a lot more muscle. I don't think Western humanitarian, Christian humanitarian sort of approach to poverty is going to do it. It's done something, and it's better than nothing. Long term, I just don't see how governments in the West are not able to justify spending taxpayers' money to help people out there. And Dutch government, Swiss government, every Western government, all the sort of OECD countries, governments are cutting development budgets. I just don't see how that is going to work. And what my own view is that part of where this could lead us, if there is leadership and the political will, is how do we make sure international trade, the rules of the game are more fair for everyone who's part of the system, so that even if it's not easy getting there, and I'm not an idealist who believes that we can somehow get this sort of utopia, but I do think we can make some progress. And part of that progress is how do we make sure there is a way to have fairer rules for people who are participating in the global economy, and for ways for those rules to be upheld. And with Trump in office, what I'm saying sounds like a joke, but it's also possible that actually the Trump presidency creates the tipping point for the whole thing to be reconfigured. Whether that's going to happen without an all-out war, we don't know. But that is the hope, that somehow the rules would work for everyone, at least better than what we have. But there's no question we're going to be able to go back to that post-45 world in which Western governments were happy to spend 2.7% of their budget to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I just think that's not working. Yeah. I'm happy to take one more.
Time for a very quick final question, if anybody...
You were going to ask something, Jonathan?
Okay. I've got permission from the vicar now to go a couple of minutes. Builds on what you've said. So let me put it this way. The theological vision and methodology and practice that you've described comes out of this kind of radical progressive wing of evangelicalism that Tearfund is one of the best exemplars of. And that's also, following that journey has been part of my personal life as well, like yours. And I think it does really well, as your videos have showed, at the personal, at the local community level. Individuals' lives really transformed, and local communities where the church is a presence really transformed. But beyond that, it's much harder to work transformative impacts, isn't it? With that kind of a methodology, at least that's my experience. What's the next step, do you think, in this trajectory of theological thinking and integral mission? Has integral mission gone far enough? What's the next stage in terms of a better theological vision and a better church practice to take it to the next stage where it really makes an inroad into goal 4, which is transforming unjust structures?
Yeah. And Jonathan, we've known each other for a very long time. My background is in politics. So even the Lausanne movement for world evangelization, which is now just called Lausanne, they had their big gathering last year in South Korea, celebrating 50 years of Lausanne. They were very happy to give platform and have mobilized resources to support the 5th mark of mission. So people like Dave Bookless has done a great job in getting evangelical Christians to embrace creation care. But they just don't want to, there's an unwillingness to take on Mark 4. Now, with reconciliation, there's a bit of sort of ending violence, reconciliation. Part of, I think, the understructure that we're not willing to touch is capitalism itself. And so the big question is, how can theology resource this wing of the church that's very activist to work with the broader church to see how we can have, which is where I think for me 8 years at the Jubilee Center was still very productive and fruitful, because work like what Michael has done in thinking through how to reform capitalism from within. I think if there's a way that agenda goes beyond just sort of Michael and some sort of folks that have been identified with relation thinking, and the church worldwide, the Anglican church, maybe giving some leadership in that, to really name and address unjust structures. And not just talk about unjust structures as human trafficking, because there was a book that came out on the 5 marks of mission, and the 2 chapters that were there in that book, again, was very local. And I think for me, we need to raise the bar a bit higher, have a bit more ambition, and feel somehow we're not this powerless to take on the big questions. When I think about after the Second World War, what people like Adenauer and Schuman did in reimagining how Europe could be governed, I think we need that sort of stuff globally. And I really believe that's the yearning that folks at Just Love are grappling with. And so if there's something that people like yourself and myself can contribute to another generation that's going to come after us that want to transform unjust structures, that's sort of where, for me, the frontier is in this agenda. Great. Thank you. I shall stop with that.
Thanks very much. So, Philip, you've given us a wonderful presentation there, some really gritty and moving personal and local stories. You've told us something about your story, which is a wonderful story and a wonderful narrative that's still ongoing, obviously. And you've presented us with a great set of questions that will continue to occupy us in the weeks ahead. So could we all give Philip a really wonderful round of applause? So thank you very much, everybody. Next week, we address the issue of welfare policy in Britain with somebody with the wonderful name of Coco Huggins, who is a PhD student in the University of Cambridge. And there is coffee and tea and biscuits, so please do hang around and chat. Thank you very much.